Welcome back. We are going to continue our discussion on the topic of deviance and social control from Henslin's text, chapter 6. This particular section of the lecture will look at the deviant behavior of crime, kind of looking at crime really as a form of deviance, which it is. It is a particular form of deviance that represents a violation of the established law. So as a deviant behavior, it may have other implications as well as we look at it from a societal standpoint. Beyond that, we're going to take a look at the judicial and legal system's responses to crime, and we'll also look at mental illness as still another form of deviance and actually compare it to crime and how the two different types of deviant behaviors are handled in our society. Interestingly, here is an illustration of how the state by state, stacks up in terms of violent crime in America. Now, violent crime, we are for the most part talking about the street crimes that we were referring to in the last section, those committed more often than not by lower socioeconomic groups. In lower socioeconomic groups, there's a higher likelihood, if you're in that lower socioeconomic group, that you're going to be a racial or ethnic minority as well. And so there are many different implications for this as you look at these illustrations and we consider some of the things that Henslin brings to our attention in this last half of this chapter. You can see, for instance, this course originating in Little Kenai, Alaska. You can see that Alaska is considered to be fairly dangerous, as higher than average as far as violent crimes per 100,000 people. Statistically, I mean, the number of violent crimes certainly is lower here because we have a smaller population, but when you compare that on a per capita basis, our violent crime rate is pretty high. So if you're looking for safe states, they're purple. And start looking around at houses, I suppose. Entry into the judicial system in our nation is through the law enforcement and police. Arrests, those things where somebody is actually picked up and stopped and carried off to jail. 90% of those arrests are made by local law enforcement agencies as opposed to federal agencies. Most police work is peacekeeping by nature. That is that using their protective role that but does give the police the right to use force. And if you remember back way early in this course, we talked about the fact that the state is the one that is the only entity that has the right to use violence in order to perpetuate itself. And so the police are really the arm of the state that has the potential for using violence if necessary in order to maintain the peace. Now, as far as the peacekeeping role is concerned, what this tells you, what this is saying really is the things we look at in Law and Order and all those other police shows is really that it's not so dramatic for the most part. It is much more of a mundane kind of a nature on a day-to-day basis. Now, there are plenty of studies that suggest that the police do, in fact, discriminate in the use of force, and there's probably a number of different factors involved in that. But one example, racially speaking, is that 60% of the persons that are killed by police are African American, who only make up 12% of the population. Now, some may say, well, more African Americans are doing things to put themselves in that spot. Others could tell you, though, that when you look at things from a statistical standpoint, the better explanation for that is that there is more of a tendency to fire at individuals of racial minorities. Police they do have the right to decide what constitutes a law violation, and in another slide or so we're going to look at this funnel of prosecution, and the very top of this is determining how a police officer defines a certain behavior. Is it defined, that deviant act, is it defined as a law violation or not? And if defined as a law violation, then the police then decides whether or not they're going to enforce this. Are they, for instance, if you go speeding by at 62 miles an hour, and the officer is also listening to, something on the radio involving a crime in another part of the town, he has to make a decision whether he's going to pursue you or stay available for this other crime. And so he decides which laws to enforce and how and where to enforce them. So the studies do suggest that police discretion could be influenced by things. I would say the studies suggest that the police discretion is influenced by things such as race, appearance, age, relationship, and other things like that. I was once told that I was stopped by a police officer in Orlando. The police officer didn't tell me this, but another policeman did. That I was stopped because for a traffic violation because I was driving a little black sports car. That the black sports car was the thing that gets you stopped more often. Here's an interesting article on the web, and I don't know if this is if that link works for you or not. Probably not, out of Blackboard or wherever it is that you're viewing this, but maybe write down this link and read this article, because it's really quite an interesting. It was a study of arrest rates of individuals going down the New Jersey Turnpike, and as you can see, what it said is African Americans made up 13.5% of the Turnpike's population and 15% of the speeders. So pretty much, what it should be, but they represented 35% of those pulled over. So it said that blacks were almost 5 times as likely to be stopped as were others, and for no reason. And this was these were things that were recorded, I believe. I think, if I remember reading the article correctly, there were actually video recordings of all of this. So it is clearly documented that this happened, and it's a very interesting study, and it talked about the crime of driving while black. How about women in crime? Look at the differences in arrest rates. Women for all these different crimes over the course of 14 years. What would be the explanation for this? Would you see the rates of arrests of women going up? And what would be the explanations for this? Lots of different things that philosophically we might say about it, but it's clear here from the trends, from the statistical abstract, that the trends are on the rise. One study suggests that fewer offenders go to prison than we think, and this is the funnel that I'm talking about. And if you can think about these numbers in terms of a funnel, at the very top are the major offenses, and these are major offenses which become known to law enforcement, and so there's probably an even a larger amount that's much larger above that. But let's say for every 1 million major offenses which become known to law enforcement, about 26% result in an arrest. Now, this is a part of that police discretion that we're talking about, the decision they have to make as to whether or not it requires an arrest or not, or whether it's worthy of an arrest or not. So right there, 3/4 of the people, and we're talking major offenses here. We're not talking like shoplifting Twinkies or something. So of those major offenses, this study suggests that 3/4 of those individuals don't get arrested. 63,000 of those who are of those major offenses then are brought to court. 63,000 people who are arrested are brought to court. So that's 6.3% of the 1 million major offenses. Most of those are convicted. You see 57,000 are convicted, and so there's one of the things that you might call from this data suggests that the law enforcement is relatively efficient in determining who to arrest or not. In other words, what kind of evidence do we have? What kind of charges will it stand up in court, and will it be prosecuted? And that's another area where the conviction rate is, and the being brought to court is also impacted. It isn't between the arrest and the court. The 26% and the 6.3% generally is either a grand jury or a district attorney making a decision of whether the evidence justifies taking that person to court. And so you see that most of them are brought to court, are convicted, and so there's a pretty good decision-making process going there. And of those, then, 2.2% altogether of the major offenses are actually sent to prison. And so almost 1/3 of the individuals that go to court, or something more than that, are actually sent to prison or serve time for their convictions. So there's a number of different kinds of things that are being drawn from this, and this is really a pretty interesting slide, I believe, and pretty interesting data to think over. That if, for instance, one of the things this tells you, that if you are brought to court the odds are that you're going to be convicted. And there's some putting that together with some other things we know about racial minorities being brought to court. Well, I think we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So if you see the funnel at the very bottom, 2.2% of those that commit a major offense go to prison. Makes you wonder. Does that mean that we have other responses in our judicial legal system for those individuals, or does it mean that our judicial legal system is really extremely ineffective? There's a question for a good research paper. We have, despite this, the highest number of prisoners in the world, and many of our prisons are facing overcrowding. We in Alaska send prisoners out to other states because we don't have room in our prisons to house the individuals who are convicted and sent to prison. Among those going to prison, or rather among those arrested for violent crimes, 2/3 of those are rearrested, so the recidivism rate is very high. And if you're a prisoner, you're more likely to be male, to have a high school education, but to be from the lower or middle social classes. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are the purpose of prisons? What should we have them for? In a slide later on, we'll talk about some of the conflicting ideas that Americans seem to have in our society about what we want out of prisons. But a lot of the readings you have most recently will suggest that a lot of people in prisons are arrested for drug use and drug distribution. And there is discussion in our society and our culture that suggests that it would be useful for us to consider whether that's the most efficient way to both to address the problem of drug sales and drug addiction and drug use, and also the best use of our prisons as well. Here's a slide about the inmates in the United States prisons, and this will give you a little bit of an idea when you compare the percentage of people in prison with the percentage of that population in the United States, what the odds are, I guess, if you belong to any one group of you being in prison. For instance, if you're younger, you can see that there's the higher percentage of individuals are younger as compared to the population, the general population. So it would suggest to me that you're more likely to be imprisoned if you're young. For heaven's sakes, look at the difference there with African Americans, who make up almost 50% of the individuals in prison, yet again less than 13% of the overall population. Whereas the numbers flip pretty dramatically if you're white. Certainly more likely to be in prison if you're male. Marriage seems to have a very positive effect on your arrest rate, and that could go back to some of the role strain theories of Merton and those that suggested, that if you have commitments, that you're more likely to conform to behaviors. That could be because of that, or it could simply reflect that the courts are less likely to put you in prison if you have children or if you're connected to somebody else. And it would also appear that past high school, at least, that the higher the education you have, the less likely you are to also be in prison. So stay in school, okay? And then there's the death penalty, which is another factor, that's very hotly debated in our society. Alaska does not have the death penalty for arrests. Many other states do, as you'll see. And there certainly is a geographical difference because of that in administration, not only in terms of what states have the death penalty, but also which states really use them much. It shows a social class bias, because wealthy people are very rarely executed. That's a good question about when we last saw a rich person executed. It shows a gender bias because it's very rare for women to be executed, and a racial and ethnic bias that says that black or Latino men who have killed whites are more likely to be put to death, and those with less education. Here is a map of the United States from a textbook that gives you an illustration of the states with death penalties. The states with death penalties are green, and the number below the state is the number of executions. And look at, for instance, the highest state is by far more than 4 times the next state is Texas, which has 423 executions in its history, so to speak. Virginia has a little over 100, and this is a slide from 2000. Well, I don't know. Let's see. These are executions since 1977, and it's from a slide in 2010. So relatively recent. You see Florida is pretty high up there as well. The story is, if you know anything about Ted Bundy, who was a serial killer who wound up in Florida and got arrested after he murdered a few girls in a fraternity house in Tallahassee, and then murdered another girl in Lake City. Finally got caught and arrested, and had other murders, I believe, in the Pacific Northwest and in Colorado. Was in jail in Colorado and escaped. And he supposedly had asked one of the prison guards, because Colorado has only rarely ever used the death penalty, as you can see from this, which states were more likely to implement the death penalty, and some suggest that that's how he wound up in Florida, that he was really looking for a place that would put a stop to him. Probably a pleasant description of what he did, but in any event, here's a bar graph that tells you the difference about gender bias, and you see that little purple thing? That's the number of women, or the percentage of women executed as compared to the percentage of men. Less women being arrested for violent crimes, we know that, but my guess is that probably 99.1% of the violent crimes are not committed by males. Race and ethnicity of prisoners on death row, and this is from 2010 also. Once again, this shows clearly that if you're African American, you have the highest likelihood of being on death row. In fact, and I don't believe we have a slide on this, but other material I have worked from has said to me that if you are African American, or a racial minority, but I believe African American in particular, it is more likely, well, we know this from driving while black, it's more likely that you're going to get stopped. We know this. I mean, one study at least gives you some suggestions. I'm sure there are other studies that reinforce this. If you're a racial minority, you're more likely to get stopped by police. You're more likely to be arrested. I think we saw that earlier about the number of prisoners and things like this. If you're taken to court, you're more likely to be convicted. The reason for that isn't necessarily because of the color of your skin, but it has to do with economic resources. If you go to court and you are coming directly from prison, the likelihood that you're going to be sentenced or convicted is higher than if you're coming in from off the street. And so individuals who get arrested and can post bail and have an attorney and then are functioning on the outside and come into court are less likely to be convicted than an individual who has stayed in prison, so can't afford bail. And so lower socioeconomic groups, and again, remember, higher percentage of minorities per capita in the lower socioeconomic groups, then are going to have a higher likelihood of being convicted. And this suggests that also that being an African American means it's more likely that you're going to be sentenced to death if convicted. And so you see, the conflict theorists would tell you that the judicial legal system is really set up to manage and control minorities and individuals who are in that marginal working class that we talked about in the last section. Henslin says that our prison system isn't working very effectively, and that's probably generally accepted stance around the United States. And he says he believes that there are competing philosophies in our culture, and that those philosophies, that competition of those philosophies, is the reason that it's not effective. What do we use imprisonment for? Some believe it's retribution, just to settle a score, and if you do this, you go to jail. Some believe it's deterrence, that criminals are less likely to commit crimes because of the possibility of going to prison, or the death penalty. That's one of the biggest arguments for death penalty, which incidentally I believe is not supported by the research, that people might not commit murder if they know they're going to get put to death. In fact, the story I just told you about Ted Bundy kind of actually flies in the face of that, if indeed that's true. Do we use prison for rehabilitation? And this is what a lot of us more liberal individuals might think, that we're trying to help people learn how to lead a better life. And studies show clearly that when you compare the influence that prison guards have over inmates versus the influence that other inmates have over inmates, the inmates win out. There's a whole other culture in prisons. That's one of those total institutions that we had talked about some weeks ago. And the inmates are the ones that do the socializing of other inmates, much more so than prison guards and prison administration and all those people that are going to prisons to work with prisoners. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind, that rehabilitation, well, it can happen, but there are a lot of things stacked against it as well. Incapacitation is the other thing. It just makes it impossible for somebody to commit more crimes if they're in prison. But of course, we know they can commit crimes there as well. But in any event, whatever the reason is we're using prison and we're using incarceration and maybe even the death penalty, we have to decide what we're using these prisons for, because otherwise we're not going to design prisons and prison programs to a way that can have the effect that we want. We just throw them in there and we have a mix of reasons and probably try to throw funding to take care of each of those reasons, but it's not sufficient to achieve any of those reasons. So moving on to mental illness for a few slides. And really this is something that was tied to one of the readings I believe you were assigned for this week on being sane in insane places. This is an article that as you take other classes with me in the future, you'll probably read again and maybe again, because it is one of those articles that is probably one of the most important studies that I've ever run across. And this has something to do with the fact that I've spent a fair amount of time working in the mental health system and dealing with clients with diagnoses and seeing the kinds of things that diagnoses can do, particularly for children, and how it can impact their future. That article is just so interesting, because what they did was they took individuals without a mental illness and they faked a mental illness and were put in psychiatric hospitals. And well, the thing was to see if anybody could really figure out they were faking or not, and the results are startling to say the least. So I do hope you'll read that article on being sane in insane places. Thomas Szasz wrote, I just love that name, Szasz. Any name with two Z's in it's got to be a cool name. He wrote that mental illnesses are neither mental nor illnesses, that they're simply problem behaviors. Mental illness is one of those things that we tend to see as kind of comes from the unconscious, perhaps something beyond our control. Therefore, that people kind of have these things, and there's not really a whole lot you can do about mental illnesses if you have that philosophy about it. And so Szasz says, that's not true. He says these are people with bad behaviors, and that the medical profession really has developed and defined mental illness to extend their control, the medical profession to extend their control over the public from the physical into the emotional range, into the behavioral area. And it's interesting that many of the mental health centers over the last 20 years or so have changed their names from mental health centers or counseling centers to behavioral health centers. When you hear behavioral health now, that is mental health in its reincarnation, and it's almost an acknowledgement that in fact this is about behaviors, and it isn't about something inside perhaps. So Szasz thought just bad behaviors, perhaps poor socialization, but the doctors now call it a mental illness so that they can extend control and have more patients, basically. So as far as Szasz is concerned, psychiatric hospitals are nothing more than another kind of prison. When you look at some of the problems that we have in our society, and one good example is the homeless, and this is another article that you've read recently. I believe during week 15 you read some articles about homelessness. How would the living conditions of the homeless lead us to label them as mentally ill, even if they're not? What are the kinds of things that homeless people do, or how do they act that might make us think that they have some sort of illness that they can't help? And it's just something to consider. I mean, in terms of how the label can impact the way we approach the problem, and we may never really deal with the problem for real, the problem that is the best solution. We may not come up with the best solution to the problem because we're really defining the problem incorrectly. I think that's something that the article on Million Dollar Murray talked to us about. Homosexuality was characterized as a mental illness, I think, until the 1970s, I believe, is when the DSM-3 took that out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses. Has demedicalizing homosexuality changed the way that the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transsexual persons are treated? Perhaps it has, and this is one of those things that's certainly been a process for this population. There's an interesting inscription on a tombstone of actually the first active duty soldier that acknowledged his homosexuality, Sergeant Levitch, who died in 1988, and said that when I was in the military, this is what his tombstone reads: when I was in the military, they gave me a medal for killing 2 men and a discharge for loving 1. So the point of this is any behavior can be viewed as desirable. Killing can be viewed as desirable, and loving could be seen as deviant. Once again, going back to I think the very first slide that we looked at in this series of slides in this lecture this week, said that deviance isn't about the behavior, it's about how we define the behavior. It's how we react to the behavior. So thanks once again. It's really been a privilege for me to be able to take you through your introduction to sociology this semester, and I do hope that you found areas of interest in this class that will encourage you to take more classes in this field. It certainly is something that affects us on a day-to-day life or day-to-day basis, and I think by now that you've kind of got a grasp of that. So one more thing, please don't forget your course evaluation. It's on your Blackboard menu for the course on the left-hand side of the screen under course evaluation. That information is really, really important to me and can help me shape this class and make it better for the future. So have a good break, and we'll hopefully see you again sometime in the not too distant future. Bye for now.